new class of merchants and
Right.
approach to realism. It was not until the Enlightenment that really there were significant artists doing, I don't know,
Non-religious works.
Non-religious.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a very good question. We're at this period where we're seeing society move away from feudalism toward sort of what we call modern cities, right? That are more similar in some ways to what we have today, where you go out and get a job and you are successful or not, right? Versus being a peasant working your ass off, and staying a peasant, right? Or being born to nobility and staying there, right? To the manor born is an old phrase we use for people who are sort of up there, right? When do we begin to see art shift away from religious imagery and toward non-religious imagery? That's a very good question. It doesn't. The first thing that we're going to see. Back up. First thing we'll see is portraits, right? Because with this new status of the individual, the importance of the individual, we start to see portraits being made not just of kings and dukes, but also portraits of merchants, right? So that will be the first non-religious subject matter that we'll see. The second non-religious subject matter that actually begins to appear is landscape painting, of all things. And that's roughly 1500-ish, right? We start to see independent landscape paintings. And prior to them becoming just landscapes for landscape's sakes, we start to see religious pictures with a whole lot of landscape and not a lot of religious content, right? As a step in that direction. At the same time that we see landscape paintings, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as we're saying. At the same time we see landscape paintings develop, we also start to see people do still lives independently, right? And we also start to see people doing scenes of everyday life. Now, because art had always been religious and moralizing within the religious idea, right? These, presenting you visual elements that you can interpret as being fulfilling on a spiritual level. It's not surprising to find out that when we actually do get landscapes, still lives, scenes of everyday life, I call them genre scenes. Scenes of everyday life, like what Vermeer painted, right? You went to the Vermeer show. That what we find is that within those, the details that are there also sort of point in symbolic and morally uplifting and instructive ways, right? So they don't end up being that far away from the religious mindset, even though they're secular scenes. And they all come up, really the first place we see them is the city of Antwerp, around 1500, which is the major port in Northern Europe at the time. Huge population, and a lot of picture buyers, right? And when you get a big market like that, you start to get artists who will specialize to corner part of it. So it's when Antwerp and the buying public becomes much more democratized, wider, and the number of pictures being made gets bigger, you start to get artists who say, I'm gonna do this and this alone, right? So you'll have artists that all they do is really landscape. Other artists that all they really do is genre scenes, right? Now we're a week and a half away from that yet, right? But we'll get there, right? And what we have with those artists, and this is an important thing, is the very first foray of artists into well, if I leave it on the ground, where'd it go?
Behind you against the wall.
Thank you. If I leave it on the ground, I won't drop it again, right? You have the first foray of artists into making works of art for an open market, on spec, right? We talked about the fact that everything's commissioned at this point. Artists aren't making works hoping someone will come along and buy it. But once you're a specialist in something, you can get away with that sort of thing. You have multiple versions of the same sort of theme, right? And people will buy them. So that's when art starts to. It's not a continuous trajectory, right? It's a sort of a blip on the screen. Okay, long answer to the question. Is that sort of good to it? Let's go back to where we are now. We were looking at the International Gothic style. How the style that was that early proto-Renaissance style that begins to add three-dimensional realistic qualities to the old Italo-Byzantine gold backgrounds and whatnot, right? And in particular, Duccio's approach to that, which was very elegant, brightly colored, right, refined, calligraphic, how that was spread to France by Duccio's pupil, Simone Martini, and how from France it just went everywhere, right? It first went to the papal court. I didn't really get into the story about the papal court. It's a great story, right? Why did the popes move to Avignon in the first place? The King of France wanted to control the papacy. He actually had the Pope tortured to death. The King of France did. The Pope cursed him from the funeral pyre. He's being burned to the stake because he's been accused of sleeping with Satan. I'm not kidding. Having said the French king got the Knights Templar to accuse the Pope of consorting with Satan and had him burned to the stake. And the great part of this story is that from the States, the Pope cursed the French king. Said, all of your kids will die without, he already had 3 kids, all of your kids will die without children. Right? And you will die without an heir. Your line will come, and it comes true. The French to this day refer to the sons of, I think that was Philip the Fair. The sons of Philip the Fair as being les rois maudits, the cursed kings, because of this, right? And it did. The French crown had been in the same family going back to around 900. This is now in 1310 or so, right? 1309, 1310. Had been the same line for 400 years, and it ends. And it shifts to a new line, right? So anyway, that's why it went to, that's why, the International Gothic style came from Siena, ended up in Avignon in the first place, right? Why the popes were there in the first place? Because they're basically puppets of the French king. The king wanted to get more tax money and have what the papacy was doing with tourism, right? Pilgrimages and whatnot. He wanted that money. He wanted part of it. So he was going to put in his own sort of puppet pope. Say that a few times fast. Puppet pope, right? And so he drives the current pope out, installs his own pope named Clement VII. Clement VII said, my predecessors did not know how to be pope. It's a great quote, right? He didn't realize how opulent it could actually be. Right? Moves it to Avignon specifically because he's beholden to the French king, right? So when Simone Martini's style goes to Avignon, the next logical step is it's going to go to France, right? It's going to go to Paris, where the French king is, and that's exactly what happens. And the French king is married, his family members are married to everybody else all over Europe, so it just, right, it goes everywhere. And that's how it becomes the International Gothic style, right? Is through exactly this sort of transition. People, what do I say, mirroring the innovations of their friends and neighbors, right? And that's because of their relations. Okay? So that gets us here, 1400. This Duccio style still living on almost 100 years after Duccio, but spreading now, right? The one on the right by the Master of St. Veronica. Did a bunch of pictures of St. Veronica. We never signed anything. So we refer to him as the Master of St. Veronica, right? That's his most famous work. We've got one of this crucifixion. Looks very, very similar to the crucifixion on the left, which was produced in the Low Countries, right? The Netherlands, right? Which was a bigger territory. We'll look at that in just a second. But you can see how similar the two crucifixions are in style, right? Even though there's some subject matter differences here and there, there's also some subject matter similarities, but they're different, or they're similar in style. That attenuated, elongated, elegant body type, right? The lyrical flow of drapery, right? These are things that came out of Duccio through Simone Martini and then all over Europe from that point. Yeah.
So just a side note, but relatable. On your worksheet 2,
Mm-hmm.
the question was the 3 regions.
You expect me to remember my questions on worksheet 2?
The 3 regions
Yes.
of the International Gothic style. So I kind of got hung up a little bit because, it did spread everywhere.
Right. I think that's not what I asked. I think what the question asked was what region. Well, I don't know. Go back and you can't expect me to have that memorized.
Well,
You've read it more recently than I have.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is the epicenter where it derived from was Avignon.
That's right.
Okay.
And then from there to Paris.
Paris.
And then from Paris to the Low Countries, to Bohemia, which is modern day Czech Republic, Slovakia,
Okay.
Germany,
Okay.
even England,
Okay.
right? It's everywhere. And to say nothing of France, and also honestly Spain. You see,
Gravity was huge with
Well, the Gaudi's 500 years later, though.
Yeah.
So that's a bit, we wouldn't put him in with that, right? Okay, so,
Okay.
okay, I'm sorry I don't have that memorized. Email me and ask me, and I'll be happy to answer the question. And third, okay, very good. Now, just by fluke, both of these works were done for Carthusians. Carthusians were a monastic order like the Franciscans and the Dominicans we talked about. They're a different monastic order. They were a reforming order. They believed in not having a lot of church decorations, although that doesn't always play out. And so there's a Carthusian monk kneeling at the crucifixion on the right. That's him in white. And he's probably, we think, either a portrait or just a surrogate for the Carthusians who would have used this piece. And it's big enough to be in a small chapel. It's about, yay, right? 2.5, 3 feet tall. Is that 2.5, 3 feet tall? Yeah, roughly 2.5 feet tall. So it's big enough to be used in public rather than in private. It's too large to be hanging on to and carrying around with you, right? And so he's their surrogate. And we'll see a number of images where the person who pays for it gets included in the front row seats, if you will, right? The one on the left we know was a Carthusian work based on some archival work people have done. We put it together. We know who originally owned it and where it was originally seen and used, right? Now, the Carthusians have nothing to do with the spread of the international Gothic style. It's just a fluke in this case, right? It's just a coincidence that we have two works within the region, Baltimore and here, that are both international style and are both Carthusian. That's just a fluke, right? So they are not responsible for the spread of the international Gothic style. But we know that this work on the left, which you remember was part of a larger work, right? Remember there were 4 panels together. 2 of them are here. 2 of them are over in Antwerp, right? They were at this monastery, which we looked at the end of class on Tuesday, the Carthusian monastery, the charter house of Champmont, right? And most of this has been destroyed now, but this particular charter house was sponsored by the Duke of Burgundy. Now he's also, I think, on your second worksheet. His name shows up, right? Duke Philip the Bold, right? Many of our members of the French court, this is now the ruling family that succeeded the cursed kings, right? Is this new family. They're the Valois family, V-A-L-O-I-S. You don't have to worry about that. You won't be tested on the Valois family. But if you're into this thing, right? Philip the Bold is the younger brother of the French king, right? Charles V, who took leadership of France in 1360, second in the Valois line of French kings. And he's referred to by historians, and even in his time, as Charles the Wise. Charles Sage, right? Charles the Wise. And the reason for this is that he realized that France was too big to govern for one person, because by this time, France had gone from being basically the area around Paris to being what we think of as France today, right? Big area. And in the Middle Ages, that's just way too much for one guy to handle. So he decided this wise thing to do was to parcel out parts of it to his younger brothers, let them rule semi-independently from the king. They're still answerable to him, right? But life goes on without a whole lot of intervention. Right? And this turned out to be particularly wise because Charles V, the older brother of Philip the Bold, his son, who succeeded him in 1384, turned out to be actually clinically psychotic, right? They didn't do clinical psychoanalysis at the time, but he was crazy. And he got France even more deeply involved in the 100 Years' War. Right? And that allowed areas like Burgundy, under Philip the Bold, to kind of remain outside of the fray. You see why we think he's so wise, right? So, Philip the Bold is the Duke of Burgundy. He's the oldest younger brother of the King of France. And he gets the richest region of the 3 regions that the king parcels out to his little brothers. We're going to look at only 2 of them, okay? Because they're very important art patrons. So Philip gives the money for this monastery, right? He provides all of the funds to found the charter house of Champmont. And he wants to do this for 2 different reasons. One is sort of the same reason the Duccio liked the idea of painting the Maestà, right? That good work will help him on Judgment Day. He's done something good, right? And the idea that good works can, in fact, provide for salvation was the mindset. In addition to that, I guess we'll talk about three things. He's got a group of 30 Carthusian monks praying for him. Nice, huh? All the time. Sin away. Right, go for it. And because they're monastic, part of the monastic order, right, they're going to be praying 7 times a day. They still follow the rules of St. Benedict, right? So they're committed to a life of prayer. Third thing is his ulterior motive. And that is that Philip was going to use the monastery as the burial site for Philip and his family. Not the king, but Philip's direct heirs. And in fact, it continued to function for that way for the next 100 years, right? As the burial site for Philip and his family. Okay? So this is why he gives the money for it. Like I said, it was very badly damaged. The French Revolution wasn't very kind to anything that stank of royalty, right? They tended to just destroy the heck out of them. Old cathedrals, monasteries. So we're lucky that some of this stuff survives from here because a lot of it was destroyed. So the Charter House of Champmont is where this was originally seen. We have some of the records of the things that they owned. So that work on the left, right, we only have half of it, was made for Philip the Bold and wound up at the Charter House of Champmont. It was here. Okay? So we know who originally had that 4-paneled thing to look at. Right? It was Philip the Bold. And as I mentioned before, these things ain't cheap. Right? I'm not buying one. I couldn't. On my lucrative Marymount salary. I'm not buying one. You're not buying one. Right? We're talking, the 1%. Right? Philip can buy one. Now, the Charter House of Champmont is in the town of Dijon. As you can see, the Duchy of Burgundy. These days, if you look at you go to your Michelin travel guides or whatever you use, Burgundy is basically this. It's this area that produces fantastic wine. There's a shelf of land, comes and drops. It's called the Golden Coast, the Côte d'Or, right? It's this perfect microcosm for making fantastic wine. And that's what it is. It runs right through here, sort of from Dijon south. And that's what we can currently call Burgundy, right? Unless you drink, Gallo. And they call it Burgundy, but it ain't, right? Okay, there we go. But in Philip's time, the Duchy of Burgundy was a lot bigger. The Duchy of Burgundy stretched all the way to Holland, right? So it included parts of France, parts of Luxembourg, most of Belgium, parts of Holland. Were all part of the Duchy of Burgundy. And when Philip inherited this area from his older brother, right, the first thing he did is he started to arrange a series of marriages in his family to make that territory bigger, right? And so at first when he gets it, it's kind of like this. And then by the end, he's got that, right? And by the end of his grandson, we're sort of all the way here, okay? And they remained through the middle of the 15th, end of the 15th century, relatively independent from French politics, right? Sort of isolated. Still connected by blood, but, right, their own thing, okay? Now, so far, we'll talk more about this. So the Chartreuse of Champmont is just outside the city of Dijon, okay? In fact, by the foundation, we have the contract to found the monastery. They said be just outside the city, 2 arrow lengths. So they got a longbowman, shot it, found the arrow, did it again, and that's where they found it, right? So if you go to Dijon, it's kind of just on the far side of the train station now, right? Is where it is. Okay? So this is an important site because Philip is not only founding it for the prayers he's going to get from the monks and the place to bury his family, but over and above that, he's going to adorn it with works of art that he's paying for, right? And the most famous work from this, and something that's worthwhile talking about, even though it's not here, is the Well of Moses, which is absolutely fantastic. In fact, it's so fantastic that it was made. Schluter died in 1406, as did Philip the Bold. So that's where we know the date on this thing, right? It's done by 1406. Already by 1416, if you went and visited this, you got an indulgence. You got time marked off your time in hell for your sins simply for having gone here in the proper mindset. It was believed to be miraculous. And as we look at it today, it is. I mean, it still is on a secular level, just one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life, right? The Well of Moses. Now, originally, it was in this area that's called a cloister. Okay, in a monastery, there's the chapel, but there are also other and secondary buildings, and there are the places where the monks live. And there's a covered walkway that links all of the major buildings, called a cloister. And inside the cloister is a garden, okay? Usually for growing medicinal herbs, but sometimes just for meditation. In this particular monastery, in the middle of the cloister, there was a natural water spring. And the Moses well was built on top of that, right? We don't know if water spurted out of it anywhere, probably not, but it bubbled up around the base. Okay? This provided the water for the monastery, which is kind of an important part of the theme of this sculpture, because the theme of the sculpture is water, life, right? Water is life. And we'll talk more about that as we look at it. So, the Well of Moses, decorating the center of the cloister at the monastery of Champmont, the Chartreuse of Champmont. It's kind of sludgy, but there's still, you can look down at the base. So now we're sort of directing our eyes downward. It sits on this pillar that there's still water down there, right? And it's beneath that grate because this was in the summertime, and in the wintertime it's above the grate, right? It still is a functioning well, okay? Provided the water for the monks. Now, what we're looking at here, the statues themselves are slightly larger than life size. I should say they're larger than my life size. They're like 6'2", right? They're big. And you'll notice that it's sort of this hexagon. Well, you probably can't tell yet, but it's six-sided. And then it spreads out almost like the eave of a house or cornice on a house, right? It kind of comes out at the top. And that's because this was just the base for something bigger. On top of this, there was originally a life-size crucifixion group. This is a model in the local municipal museum in Dijon, recreating what it originally looked like, right? So the bit we're looking at ends here with our statues. And originally on top, and we have some drawings, we have some descriptions, there was Christ on the cross, and at the foot of the cross was Mary Magdalene and John and the Virgin Mary, lamenting his passing, like the crucifixion things that we looked at, right? So there's Mary Magdalene with her hair out, right? We saw her before with her hair out gesture. So this is all kind of conjecture here because this was all destroyed during the French Revolution. Let's get rid of anything that reeks of royalty. All that's left is the chest and the head of Christ, which was on loan when I went to Dijon. It was on loan to an exhibition center, so I haven't seen it. Right? I've seen pictures. Okay? So down below, what we have are the prophets who foretold the coming of the Messiah. 6 figures from the Old Testament, 6 prophets, Moses among them, whose words from the Bible talk about the fact that the Messiah, the Savior, is coming. Right? So they're an introduction to what we see up here, and that then accounts for the weeping angels that we see over the shoulders, just like we saw in John's Lamentation, just like we saw in those 2 little crucifixion panels, right? They are lamenting the fact that up above them, Christ is dying or dead. Okay? So we're really only looking at part of the work. And originally, it would have been towering over you, right? So the building that we see here is to protect it from the weather. It's not original, right? It wouldn't have fit in here, okay? The carving is incredible. The amount of detail is incredible. And this is something we're going to be looking at today and on Monday. This is my favorite class of the entire semester. This is what I do. When I do my own research, this is what I look at, is this sort of stuff. What we see happening with the International Gothic style as we move into the 15th century is that the seeds that were planted by Duccio and John spring into an interest in almost hyper-realism. We'll see microscopic detail. We'll see an interest in just looking at things sort of beards, hair by hair. And as we're looking at this is carved sandstone, right? The amount of detail in the wings, and then the entire thing is painted. In fact, most sculptures were painted up until like Michelangelo, right? They originally were polychrome, painted in multiple colors. It made them seem even more lifelike, right? In our reconstruction. That would have added to this sense of the miraculous that allowed the Pope already in 1416 to grant an indulgence to anyone that went in proper attitude, right? You couldn't go Baroque, right? Or goofing off. You had to go there in the right mindset, and you could get an indulgence. So each of the faces has one of the prophets, and each of them is labeled on the bottom. So you can see here it says Moses prophet, David prophet, right? They're labeled for us. But in addition to being labeled for us, each one of them has something in their, many of them have something in their costuming that helps us to identify them as well. Right? And it's called the Moses well because he's the most sort of dramatic of the group. Right? So he's on the left here carrying this scroll. On the scroll is written the words from Moses' text that foretell the coming of the prophet. Right? Foretell the coming of the Messiah. Sorry. Right? Ditto for David. Okay? So there's the face of Moses, and look at the realism in his face. Look at the interest in making him look like an individual. The lines and the creases in his brow. And remember that this would have been painted. The flesh would have been flesh colored. The eyes would have had whites and irises painted in them, right? I like the fact that I've always makes this joke, but I think it's actually accurate. Like, Moses parts the Red Sea, and he also seems to part his beard, right? And I think that's a subtle way in which we identify him as Moses, right? Now, the less subtle ways, you'll see in his left hand, he's got the tablets from the Ten Commandments, right? That helps us to, even if you can't read down below, and some people couldn't read, that helps us to identify him as Moses. And there's a third kind of odd thing here. He's got horns. I was making a joke about your headphones before, right? But he's got horns. And in fact, in a lot of medieval images, Moses is shown with horns.
Why?
Yes, why? That's a very good question. Why was Moses shown with horns? It goes back to a very strange, by the way, even Michelangelo does a sculpture of Moses 1510, 1515, right? To decorate the tomb of the Pope. And even he puts the nubs of a horn up there. So we'll come, why? I'm trying to figure out how to set this up the best. You ever heard of St. Jerome? He's one of the four fathers of the Catholic Church, right? And I can't name them all. Augustine, Jerome, the other two. 4th century AD, right? Like I never have been a Catholic. I'm certainly not a good one. It's all art. It's the only way in, right? St. Jerome was a cardinal in Rome, right? In the 4th century. Took it upon himself to correct all of the translations of the Bible that were out there into an official Latin version, right? So today we talk about the Vulgate Bible. That is St. Jerome's Latin translation, because the Bible was written in Hebrew, right? In Aramaic, in Greek. And it got translated in the earliest centuries of Christianity by various people who made various mistakes. So Jerome, a scholar in all these languages, took it upon himself to fix it. Come up with one official Latin Bible that the church will use. Okay? For this and other things, he's now St. Jerome. Okay? Now, prior to St. Jerome, there were all sorts of things out there where people had gotten the word. And you ever run Google Translate on something and see what comes up? It's kind of fun. right? My wife and I are booking we're doing a summer trip in Brittany this summer, and we were looking at these reviews of restaurants and hotels and whatnot, and through Google Translate, they say the most crazy things because it just doesn't work, right? And people make mistakes in translation all the time, right? So Jerome's going out and fixing these all. One of the big things that he fixed, already fixed in the 4th century, was the fact that when Moses came down with the 10 Commandments, right? The Bible says his face shone with the glory of God, right? Reflected the glory of God. And somebody made a mistake and said Moses had horns, right? Now, that was fixed already in the 4th century, but it had already become a shorthand for identifying Moses. So even though it's extraordinary to think of a guy with nubs on his head outside of Halloween, right? It remained a shorthand for visiting Moses. I mean, you think it's crazy? He just talked to a bush that was on fire, right? That carved the 10 Commandments in his tablet. So you're worried about the horns? You know? It's not any more extraordinary than any of the rest of the story, right? He parts the Red Sea and they walk through on dry land. Come on. Horns? It's small fry by comparison, right? So Sluder knows, viewers know, Moses didn't have horns, but it became a way to identify him. It just became part of the visual lexicon, right? This is how we identify him. Okay? So, subtle details that help us to identify Moses, and not so subtle ones like his name beneath the stand on which he's posing, right? How do we know this is King David? Say it louder. The crown. Excellent. So he's wearing a crown. He could be another king in the Old Testament as well, right? But it says David, right? Notice that the crown has flowers in it, and those flowers, hey, Marymount, fear the fleur, right? They're the fleur-de-lis, which is the French royal symbol. Ha-ha, right? This is paid for by Philip the Bold, the younger brother of the King of France, right? This has royal connections. Okay? So the crown helps us to identify it as David. How else might we know he's David? Something else here is pretty subtle. Look at his robe. Look at the hem of his robe. Those are harps, right? David wrote the book of Psalms. David was a musician. And they look just like the harps that show up on Harp Lager, right? If you're into beer. And for the underage people, I am not recommending it, so far as you know. A series of harps runs all the way down each side of it. So this is their way of identifying him as David, right? Now, these two are the ones that are most easy to identify this way. And again, the text on his scroll would also help to identify him, right? Because we would know what text that came from. Notice how different his face looks than Moses's. Again, Sluder using details to characterize. Okay? That's the direction in which International Gothic develops, right? Particularly in Burgundy. I'm going to walk our way around a little bit, right? So here we've moved around from David, right? Next to David, as we walk around, is Jeremiah, and he's identified down below, and again by his scroll. There's less here to identify him as Jeremiah, but look at, this is carved out of stone, and look at that book, right? The spaces between the pages, the fingers up inside the book. How do you get in there? And how do you do that, right? This is, for me, it still is a miraculous work of art, right? Phenomenal. And you'll notice as well, he's squinting while he reads. There are actually, you can't see them in this, and I tried with my telephoto to get a shot of it. You can't really even see it well. There are tiny little holes here, like he's got long hair, right? So just over the backs of his ears are these little holes here and here. He originally wore glasses. He was a pair of wireframe glasses like this on his nose, and he's doing this. Right? And you can tell from the look on his face now that he's looking through reading glasses, right? Squinting at the text as he reads it. That adds this level of realism that started with Giotto and Duccio, but man, this is leaps and bounds away from that, right? We've really come into something that's incredibly realistic. Okay, here we go. Coming further around, so that was Jeremiah on the left. There's Zechariah on the right. each one of them in a different pose, each one of them in different costumes. Again, all of this would have been polychromed. Zechariah and Daniel, as we work our way around it, right? And then finally Daniel and Isaiah, right? So we're coming back around to where Moses is just over Isaiah's left shoulder on your right. Right? We work our way all the way around it. And I wanted to end with this one and just look at Isaiah, who's one of my favorites in the group, because I love the way that the two of them are looking around the corner at each other, right? As we talk about this interest in realism, they've become alive, right? They're not stuck up against the wall. They're not confined by the architecture of the well. They are looking at each other, right? They're conversing with each other. Who's that over there, right? And as we look at his face, and you can see the degree of realism in the handling of the wrinkles, you can even see on his temples, the blood vessels here on his temples are pulsing, right? They're filled with blood. It's so hyper-realistic, right? And that is something that we're going to begin to talk about as we're looking at works of art that developed in Northern Europe, particularly in Burgundy, right? The Low Countries, Eastern France, right? Develop out of the International Gothic style. It develops toward heightened sense of realism. Now, one last thing. Remember that this was, I should have talked about this before. Remember that this is sitting on top of a well, so it's kind of a multimedia work, right? It has sound as well. But on top of it, there's that crucifixion scene. And there's a symbolism here because the physical water that the monastery needs to survive is associated with Christ as the water of life, right? Christ who gives us salvation. Right? Those two things are linked hand in hand. And the sculpture is meant to sort of draw that connection between spiritual life and physical life. Remember spiritual life as you get what you need for this physical, right? So they're very, very strong religious subtext, symbolic subtext to what we're looking at. Now, like I said, this was in Dijon, right? Or just outside Dijon, in what is Burgundy proper. But the Duchy of Burgundy was a lot bigger. And we know from records that Klaus Schluter came from this region, what is today the region of Flanders. It's sort of the eastern part of Belgium. In fact, if you pay attention to the news, there were a couple of times in recent history that Flanders has tried to become independent, just like Czechoslovakia broke up, right? They've tried to become independent, but it's never really gone anywhere, right? But Flanders is, at this point, a lot of eastern part of Belgium. And Klaus Schluter came from exactly this region. He came from the city of Brussels, which is smack dab in the middle of the old county of Flanders, right? And we know this. He did some sculptures there for the town hall in Brussels before actually moving to Dijon to work for Philip the Bold. And what we're going to see is this realism, right? The level of realism we see with the Well of Moses that transcends anything from the International Gothic style, right? It just goes beyond that. The artists that are doing it all come from Flanders. And that's never really been explained. There's something in the water, right? Those artists are the ones that are interested in this kind of extraordinary hyper-realism, right? Charles's second younger brother was the Duke of the region called Berry, Duke Jean de Berry. And he too was a major art patron. He too was interested in works of art that had this increased degree of realism. And he too used artists that came from the Low Countries. The most famous artists that worked for him were the Limburg brothers. 3 of them worked together as manuscript illustrators. Now, the word manuscript means written by hand. Manu is hand in Latin, script written. Handwritten book. hand painted, not printed, right? A one-of-a-kind book. And in this case, this book is a book of hours, the very rich hours of Jean de Berry, the Très Riche Heures. We call it that because that's what Jean de Berry called it. He had an inventory of all the works that he owned. He had 3 different manuscripts by the Limburg brothers, John, Paul, and Herman. Right? And in his inventory, this one is listed as the very rich hours. It's the swankiest of all of them. It's bigger, it's more sumptuously illustrated. Right? Now, a book of hours. We need to explain what this is. A book of hours is a prayer book. And the title of it is based on the idea that monks pray at set hours during the day. 7 set hours during the day from monastic prayer. So if you're going to pray at home, you're going to model your behavior after that. And this prayer book tells you which prayers to say on which days during the year. That's what a book of hours is, right? The problem is it doesn't read like a diary. You don't start off with January 1st. The prayers are set into thematic groups. So what you have at the beginning is a table of contents that tells you which page to turn to for the prayer for that day, right? So you know whether it's a prayer to the Virgin Mary or a prayer to this group of saints, right? Or a prayer to the Passion of Christ, based on the Passion of Christ. It would tell you where to look, right? Where to find it. So it opened up the Book of Hours. Every Book of Hours would start with a calendar, right? And with the calendar, it would say, turn to this page, read this prayer. And what the Limburg brothers have done, and this is not innovative, this was in most books of hours, is they illustrate each of the months in the calendar with a scene of something that happens during that month. So this is January, right? And this would have faced the calendar that tells you what prayers to say on which day in January, right? And it illustrates Jean de Berry himself. That's him in blue. On the right, almost looks like a halo behind him. He's sitting in front of a fireplace. You can see the fire licking up from behind it, right? A massive fireplace. He's at a table covered with foods being served on gold and silver plates, including out of a big gold boat. He's a dog lover. It's a nice Dalmatian-looking thing in the foreground, but there's also 2 cute little guys on the table. He's a bad dog owner, right? Don't let your dogs up on the table. Right? And he's being visited by his entourage, and the words that hang in the air above him say, come forth, approach, right? And these people in very, very fine clothing are coming his way. There's our aquamarine blue again that we talked about, that very expensive blue pigment, right? And in the background is a tapestry hanging on the wall. So he's not outside, right? And you can see if you look at the upper left corner how it bends around the corner. That's to help keep him warm inside his castle in January, in addition to that big old fireplace, right? Okay, that's Jean de Berry. This was made for him. What does he see when he opens the book on page 1? Himself, as warm and happy and luxurious as he could possibly be, with everybody coming to say hi, right? It's flattering to him, okay? So, if we open it up, right, we would have the calendar on the opposite page. So here's the January calendar page. You see it says Janvier, right? And on each day of the month, it tells you what page to turn to, what prayer to be said. So if we wanted to use this, we'd have to just go through and say, what's today? 25th, right? So, 26th. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right, you go turn to that page, right? And using it, okay? So this was a devotional work, but at the same time, it's also a work of luxury, right? It fills 2 different things for Jean de Berry. We call these activities that are linked to each of the months the labors of the months, right? And they have a long-standing tradition going all the way back to ancient Rome, but fairly widespread from around the 12th century onward in Europe, right? And they became sort of codified. The standard activity for January was almost always a feast. Right? The standard activity for February was foot warming, warming your feet by the fire. Right? They were very, very standard activities. And what's interesting as we move to February is we don't see Jean de Berry in his court anymore. We see the exact opposite. We see the peasants who work for him. But look at the realism of it. Right? Look at the snow, the footprints, and the seeds that the birds are picking up at the bottom. It's incredibly detailed, just as Klaus Luder was. Right? Yeah.
On the top,
That's the zodiac. Yeah. And so it gives us the sort of changing of the zodiac times. You know, modern day Christians tend to think of this as, you know, astrology as being sort of satanic, right, and evil. But it was seen all part of God's plan, right? But you'll notice on the top of the one on February, and that's a good observation to bring that in. I wasn't going to talk about it, but it's fine. The one in February has a bunch of numbers and words and so forth. The one in January doesn't. Jean de Berry and all three brothers died in a plague in 1416, and it's unfinished, right? So certain parts were never filled in. But originally, the top of the one on the left would have also been filled in, right? In fact, some of the pages were painted by another artist, by someone who inherited this book in around 1480, right? So February gives us the outside versus inside, peasants versus royalty. They both have fires. He's got so much he needs a screen. They've got so little they got to hike up their dresses. And what's funny is that when they do, you get to see their hoo-ha, right? They're naughty bits, right? And on a certain level, that's kind of Jean de Berry's view of peasantry. They're workers. They're not as special as he is, you know, and then this demeans them on a certain level. And a lot of the images of peasantry that appear in the Very Rich Hours and in other manuscripts sort of make a point of demeaning the peasantry. And we think it has to do with social changes where they're starting to become more, we saw in Florence and Siena, people are becoming divorced from the feudal system in places. This is like keeping them in place, right? Show them as being jerks, right? Or debased in some way, right? But it's also just kind of funny, right? His little penis and her little naughty bits too, right? It's not the only detail though, right? The details are there to it's what people are doing at this time. The ruts in the snow as the figure is leading the donkey off to the village in the background, right? And keep in mind, by the way, the entire thing is about like yay. So my detail here that I'm showing you is maybe like this. But again, the amount of detail that they brought into it. The haystack with the snow on top of it. The snow that's fallen into the crooks of the trees. The sort of icy look. You know, when it snowed a couple weeks ago, right? There's a wonderful thing that happens when it snows. There's like no color, right? Everything's become sort of shades of gray and white. Right? I really like that, right? Things become darker. And Lindbergh brothers understand that, right? So we have this guy now chopping twigs for the fire outside. Snow falling into the crooks. Look at the figure, I think it's a woman, huddled up, wrapping her scarf around her head, but she's breathing steam. Can you see that? Coming out of her mouth. And again, this detail is smaller than half of your fingernail, right? And our birds that are picking up the seed, right, and the huddled sheep inside this ramshackle shed. You'll notice the perspective's kind of screwy. We haven't really reached the point where we have a perspective scheme yet, right? It doesn't work. It's really about showing us things, but there still is this incredible interest in microscopic detailing, right? Now we've got a Lindbergh Brothers page here. We've talked about how altarpieces get cut up, right, by less than scrupulous dealers through time, and rather than selling just one painting, you could sell 5, 7, 15, whatever. Manuscripts suffered the same fate, especially if it had been dropped in a puddle or something like that, right? Then you cut out the pages that are in good shape and you sell them page by page by page. Right? No one would do it anymore. But anywhere between the Middle Ages and the 20th century, you would find this. And so here is St. Christopher. St. Christopher, by legend, was a giant. He's kind of discredited anymore. I mean, we still Catholics still buy into him. The whole legend of St. Christopher as a giant who, because of his giant stature, worked basically as a ferry boat, brought people across this river, right to the other side. And at one point, according to the legend, a child shows up, and St. Christopher says, "Do you want to lift to the other side?" And he said, "Yes." And so he puts him on his shoulders, walks to the other side. Every step, the kid got heavier. Until he got to the far side, put him down, and said, "What happened? How come you got heavier every step?" He goes, "I'm Jesus, and I'm carrying the sins of the world on my shoulders. So you carry them too." Right? And that's why he got progressively heavier as he crossed. Now, our scene in the middle, not nearly as gorgeous as the very rich hours, but still shows some of the detailing that we saw there. We don't know who it was made for. The border decorations are similar to some other loose leaf pages floating around, but none of them give us anything that suggests who might have originally owned it. It could have been Jean de Berry. We don't know for sure. But the Limburg brothers, working for Jean de Berry, were allowed to work for other people as well. Right? So it's, again, a very luxurious piece, right? And the National Gallery, they don't have this out on the walls, right? You have to ask to see it. And they'll show it to you, right? Make an appointment and go down. So what we're seeing with the Limburg brothers is the same thing we saw with Klaus Schluter, which is an art that is very, very much interested in amazing levels of detail, right? Amazing levels of realism, almost as if it's been observed with a magnifying glass, right? Schluter achieves it in sculpture, Limburg brothers in manuscripts, both groups of artists. Klaus Schluter on the one hand, the three Limburg brothers on the other, they all came from this area in the Low Countries, right? The Limburg brothers were from Nijmegen, sort of Holland, right? They then trained as goldsmiths in Paris before they became manuscript illuminators. You imagine working as a goldsmith, you're pretty good with micro details, right? That helped them. So what we're seeing as we're looking at these works, whether it's Schluter or the Limburg brothers, we're seeing an interest in increasing the level of detail. And this would be the trend, the characteristic of art that comes from this region in the 15th century. We'll see it everywhere, and we'll see it get even more phenomenal, right? This level of detail and realism. So all this stuff, right, this international Gothic style, we were looking at works that were done for Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, right? I have this slide in here. We can pass by some of this because we don't really need it. We saw where Burgundy was, right? This green part in the middle to the east of France, to the west of the Holy Roman Empire that included Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of France, all as a unified duchy, quasi-independent from France, which is important because this is the era of the 100 Years' War. Very, very prosperous, the Low Countries were. Right? The city of Bruges, which you see close to England there, was the biggest port in all of Europe, outside of Paris, right? The second biggest one outside of Paris. Right? Really prosperous region. And they were able to triangulate and trade with the Holy Roman Empire, trade with England, trade with France, because they were able to keep independent from the war that was raging between France and England. Right? That helped them to get wealthy. There's a famous story of somebody coming from Florence in Italy up to Bruges and saying, "Man, these people know how to dress." Right? They were just impressed with how much money everybody had, and they were also impressed with how many pictures everybody had in their houses, paintings. Right? It's a very, very, very prosperous region. We're going to focus on this now for the next couple of classes, and this will be the next worksheet as well, is to talk about the 15th century in this region of Flanders. We've already started talking about artists that came from here and worked somewhere else, right? So this work of art, probably by a Flemish artist, Flanders Flemish, working for Philip the Bold, Klaus Schluter, working for Philip the Bold, the Limburg brothers, working for Jean de Berry. Okay? They're all from this region. We're not going to go back and look what was produced there. Right? What is actually made in this region. And we are lucky enough to have a work of art made by the single greatest painter from this region. For my money, just one of the greatest that ever walked the planet, right? Our Annunciation by Jan van Eyck. So he is stationed in the city of Bruges, and I think I have that animated coming up. And he spent most of his career as the court painter. Well, here, I do have it right there, Bruges. Okay? And he spent the majority of his career working as the court painter to the grandson of Philip the Bold. Just to make it confusing, Philip the Bold's grandson was called Philip the Good. They're all either Philip or Charles, right? Just like in England, there are all these Williams and Harrys, right? Dynastic names. Philip the Bold's grandson is Philip the Good, inherits this entire region, makes it even a little bit bigger, hires Jan van Eyck as his court artist. Van Eyck works for him. Very little survives of what he did for Philip, but he also works for all of Philip's court as well, and a lot of that survives. Our work, the National Gallery Annunciation, may be the only surviving work that Van Eyck did particularly for Philip. The only surviving one. We think it was made for the Chartreuse of Champmont, the charter house of Champmont, outside of Dijon. Remember, Philip the Good's grandfather had founded this place as a burial site for himself and his heirs. That means Philip the Good's father and grandfather are buried here. Philip the Good commissions works of art to go here. We have an inventory that talks about a triptych by Jan van Eyck. Right, 3 wings. Central panel with 2 folding wings on the sides. We saw diptychs before, triptych. And it tells us that one of the panels is an Annunciation by Jan van Eyck. Now there are 3 or 4 surviving Annunciations by Jan van Eyck. But this one, notice how the perspective goes off to your right. It looks like, make your eye go that direction. That, coupled with the tall proportions, we're absolutely sure this is the left wing of an altarpiece. It's about 3 feet tall. Left wing of a very large altarpiece. It could well be the one that was here. We don't have a smoking gun, right? Circumstantial evidence suggests that this is probably the only surviving work by Jan van Eyck that he made for Philip. Philip the Good loved the level of realism. At one point, he's about to get married to the Princess of Portugal, the daughter of the King of Portugal. So he sends Van Eyck over to Portugal to paint a portrait. Send it back to him, see if he likes it or not. Right? He loves the idea of the marriage alliance, right? He's going to love getting into the Spanish house. Right? But he wants to see if she's cute enough. So he tells Van Eyck, go paint her, and Van Eyck paints 2 portraits, and he sends one back by boat, and he sends the other one back by land to make sure they get to him. Philip goes, okay, I'll marry her, right? They're lost, sadly. Right? Somebody suggested that the face of the Madonna here is based on her, Isabella of Portugal, but there's no proof, right, for that. Right? So, our Annunciation. You can already tell from looking, I think, that there's an amazing amount of detail here, right? Like incredible. If we think back to what we looked at with Annunciations before, they were pretty simple. They were getting more detailed, but they're pretty simple. We got that gold background from the International Gothic style. Angel comes in from the left and kneels. We still have that. Virgin on the right, with praying. She's got her book on a table. We still have that, right? She's got it in front of her as well. Right? Some of these details are still very, very much the same, but what Van Eyck has done is to elaborate the setting. Right? Where is this taking place? What does that look like to you? It looks like a church. Indeed, it does. But if you think about a church, if you've ever been inside a Gothic church, like the National Cathedral, right? How high are the arcades on the sides of a church? They're pretty tall, right? How big are they when they stand up? They're pretty freaking huge, right? So they're not really in scale to the interior, but people aren't really worried about scale yet, right? Some people have suggested that Van Eyck is trying to draw a connection between the church and the Virgin Mary, that she is the church. That might make some sense, right? Most churches were called Notre Dame, right? They were named after the Virgin Mary, so that might make some sense. Right? In the Walters Art Museum piece, we saw God up above, Alpha and Omega, right? And the dove coming down to the Virgin Mary as she leans toward the angel. And the angel's got his words on a banner, right? And her words are on her book, right? Now look at Van Eyck's. We still have the dove coming down. Can you see that? Right? And you can still see the streaks, but there's no God up there, right? It's just coming through an open window. I've got some wonderful details of this because it's easy getting close on this. You can also see there's a fresco of Esau on the wall behind. We could spend all day going through the symbols, but there's the dove of the Holy Spirit coming directly toward the forehead of the Virgin Mary. And instead of coming from God himself, it's coming through a window. And with this in mind, there's a couple of interesting things. First, there's 7 rays of gold. 7's a good Christian number, right? 7 days of creation. For Catholic, there's 7 deadly sins, right? There's the 7 joys of the Virgin Mary. There's the 7 sorrows of the Virgin Mary. But 7's is this good note that's involved in it. 7 rays of gold coming down from the window. Now, the window as a metaphor. The light is coming through those windows on the left. Right? It's casting in. You can see it hits the inside of the wall. The window's closed, even though we've got this very solid looking dove. Right? So it didn't fly in through that window. Right? It's a closed window. This goes back to a very, very well-known metaphor for the miracle of the Annunciation. The question comes up, when you think about it realistically, how can she still be a virgin even though she's pregnant? Right? And the analogy, the metaphor was that the Virgin Mary is the paragon of purity. Right? Cleanliness. She's sinless. She's the vessel most pure. Clean. And if light can pass through glass, clean vessel, without breaking the glass, why can't the light of God pass through the vessel most pure without changing her virginal state? I'm not as eloquent with phrasing that, but you get the idea, right? As light passes through glass and leaves it unbroken, the light of God can pass into the Virgin Mary and leave her a virgin. This was really well known from around the 12th century on as an analogy, right, for the virgin birth. And Van Eyck makes reference to it. Right? The light has come through the window, the unopened window, falling on the head of the Virgin Mary. And as light passes through glass, it will pass into her, and she will remain a virgin. Now, interestingly, Van Eyck has put God up there. He's put it in a detail. There's the God of the Old Testament in a stained glass window up above, right, with angels overhead, and with the same book. I think it even says Alpha and Omega on it. It's kind of worn away, right? But it even says, and standing on Asia. I'm not quite sure why that is. Or with Asia on it, but there he is. There's God. Right? Looks kind of like Christ. They're all the same in Christian theology, right? So he's adopted this into a much more realistic kind of image, right? Where instead of just having God float up there, he's part of the architecture that we see in the building. I'm with some of the details. Look at that, right? When we look at Klaus Schluter's book, we were talking about sculpting the pages, but Van Eyck, you can almost read it, and in some of his books you can, right? Read the words. Now, again, this details about maybe that. So he hasn't given us exact words, but he has given us letters that we can read in some of the marginal declarations and some of the larger initial letters that you can read. People have worked on this and tried to figure out exactly what book it is, and we can, right? And it's kind of typical for Van Eyck, because he's actually inventing it. He's not like putting the book in front of him and doing it. It's all coming out of here. The same thing's true with the jewelry that they're wearing. We can't find a piece of jewelry that looks exactly like that, because he's making it up, and it's just fantastic that way.
Are they working with some kind of magnifying glass to do these details?
That's the really, really good question. Was there a magnifying? I think that it can't in addition to a magnifying glass, the smallest brush you've ever seen, right? Look at the pearl. She's got this little bookmark, right? It's a rod with a pearl bunch on the end of it. Excuse me. Look at the light on the pearls. It's consistent, right? It's the same light falling on every pearl. You can tell it's a pearl because pearls do that iridescent thing, right? Where you can see the light on the surface, but then you see it kind of come in from the inside. And he's got that figured out somehow. And you'll notice that you can't really see a brush stroke anywhere, right? It's been all blended so that you don't see, like with Giotto, where we saw the lines that sort of stroked it. And the reason for that is that Van Eyck is using oil paint. We'll talk more about that. But Van Eyck is credited with, this was on the third worksheet, he's credited with actually having invented oil paint. We know he didn't, but he's like the best at it. And because oil paint dries very, very slowly, you can blend the strokes. Whereas tempera dries almost immediately, and you still see those strokes on it, right? So it's just phenomenal, right? And even because it's on parchment, and you get the sense it's not paper, right? That's landscape. And you can see the edge there as she's been working her way through her book. I love Van Eyck, right?
The detail on her robe is
Yeah.
stunning.
We also have, from the angel, right, there's his words, Ave Gratia Plena. Remember in the International Style one, he was holding that banner, behold, full of grace, right, Dominus Tecum. We only have the first part, so it's Ave, and there's our abbreviation, Gratia Plena. And the words are coming out of the angel's mouth, and you can see his teeth, right, the lips are parted as he speaks to her. Again, those jewels, right, I got other details we can see of that, just fantastic, right? So that's what we saw there. She responds with her words, but what's fascinating is they're upside down because they're coming out of her mouth. So, ecce ancilla Domini, right? So you read them in the direction that the sound traveled out of her mouth, and they come back toward the angel. Right? He does this in two different paintings, right? Paints her words upside down, right? In order that they emit from her mouth. So these elements are the same things we saw in the Walters work on the right, but they're done much, much more realistically. It's a little blurry because I'm getting really blown up here, right? But you can see also her teeth, her mouth is parted. But then look at other details like the pearls and the ruby in her crown, the individual hairs on her forehead, the way the light strikes the lens of her eye, and how it lights the iris around the pupil. Right? It's just utterly phenomenal. Finicky, almost, right? But in an amazing and wonderful way. We'll try to wrap this up. She's seated directly in front of three windows. And you'll notice that the three windows are the same design, but different colors, red, blue, yellow. Probably symbolic. Probably a reference to the Trinity. Three parts, the same but different. Right? Father, Son, Holy Ghost. So we get three windows, the same but different. Right? And throughout the building are these elements that seem to suggest symbolism. I wanted to give you a close-up because the observation that he's doing and the amount of detail that transcends International Gothic stuff by a mile. These are what are called mullioned glass, right? So a glass blower, this is like what you see on the bottom of a Coke bottle or a wine bottle, right? The glass blower will have a piece of glass on the end and it'll spin it and it'll come out with this sort of circular bit that ends up sort of being like a magnifying glass almost, right? And it refracts light strangely. So here, directly just off to the left of her head, you can see parts where her blue robe is picked up as a reflection. But you can also see that because it's a lens, the landscape outside, which you can see on the sides, gets bent around, and sometimes you see it on the top part of the glass. And sometimes you see the sky on the bottom part of the glass because of the way it's reflected. Right? Spend that kind of time looking and trying to paint. It's phenomenal. And then we look at the jewels. Oh my God, the jewels, right? On the angel's robe. I love the fact that the angel has perfect fingernails. Of course he does, right? Who needs a pedicure in heaven? Or manicure in heaven? But velvet robe with gold, the pearls, the sapphires, and the sense of the three-dimensional quality, right? There's no sort of confusion with the three-dimensional sense, nor is there any confusion distinction in those things that are transparent, like sapphires, and those things that are translucent, like pearls. I mean, just this sort of detail is a hallmark of it. I love the fact that the angel's carrying this crystal scepter. And you can see the hand behind the scepter, and you can see how, okay, so this is a piece of rock crystal that's been carved into a tube, right, for the scepter. And as a piece of transparent rock, the light's hitting it from this side, and you can see where it hits on the outside of the scepter, and how it refracts on the back end of the scepter underneath, and how that light, when it passes through, this goes back to our idea of a magnifying glass, right? It concentrates the light as it hits him on the hand. Right? This is close observation, right? This is art not as just beautiful, but this is art about a way of looking and understanding the world around you, right? And really understanding it. And down below, and then you can see the hand through the scepter, but it also looks as if it refracts a little bit, like it magnifies a bit, it bends as the light does passing through. And again, this reiterates what we talked about in the first, which is light passing through things. Seems to be a metaphor that I was working with. I know it's 12:15 and I got a class at 12:30, so I'm gonna stop. We got 3 more slides from this. We'll look at this and look at other people from this century. Best painting in the National Gallery, right? Go see it tomorrow. It's just fantastic.